Lecture 41, May 22, 1958. Ladies and gentlemen, I concluded the last session by interpreting the claim that the whole is the true, and also by trying to tell you something about the place of the concept of system in dialectical philosophy, and specifically in the idealist and Hegelian form of dialectical philosophy. Now you may think, and this is a point of considerable importance, that the concept of system itself is precisely what cannot apply to dialectic, as I have attempted to show. For this concept suggests a philosophy of origins, that is to say, a philosophy where the totality is in a certain sense unfolded on the basis of an absolutely first principle. And, indeed, when we speak of system we generally think of a seamless and wholly self-contained structure of thought, something we would describe in logical terms as a closed deductive context. And in a deductive context of this kind everything else is generally derived by inference from a single highest principle. If you proceed inductively, on the other hand, and instead of deriving everything from some such highest principle you attempt to advance from the particular to the universal, then, according to traditional logical doctrine, you can never be completely certain of the matter in question. Thus if up to this point all human beings in the past have died, and you extrapolate from this that human beings are mortal, you are not yet justified in purely logical terms in concluding that human beings in every case will actually die, since it is at least possible that one will fail to do so. But if there were something about the principle of the human being which ensured our mortality, we could be relieved of this difficulty and could confidently affirm such a claim as purely a priori. The traditional conception of system is precisely one which involves strict derivation from a single specific principle, and in that sense it represents the opposite of what I said at the start about Hegelian philosophy. I should now like to try and show you, taking another passage from the Phenomenology of Spirit, that the Hegelian concept of system, or, to put it in less pedantic and historical terms, that the dialectical concept of totality is actually the opposite of that approach. And here I should also like to present once again the central motif of the dialectic in a somewhat different light. I am talking about the idea that the truth can only be grasped as result, where this result is not just something that emerges at some given point but, rather, includes the process within itself as the necessary condition of its own validity, of its own meaning. The passage I wish to read to you in this context is also drawn from the preface to the Phenomenology, and is particularly relevant here because it reveals the contrast with the traditional conception of system and thus also with the static conception of truth in an especially striking way. Hegel writes, among the various consequences that follow from what has just been said, this one in particular can be stressed, that knowledge is only actual, and can only be expounded, as science or as system. And furthermore, that a so-called basic proposition or principle of philosophy, if true, is also false, just because it is only a principle or basic proposition 2 in the specific context of the history of philosophy. This claim is explicitly aimed at Fichte's doctrine of knowledge, 3 in its first version of 1794, for a work which indeed in a certain sense is presupposed by Hegel's system and which does effectively attempt to derive the whole of philosophy from some such a first principle or proposition 5. But this claim of Hegel's stands in downright contradiction to what we have just been talking about, because the criterion of a deductive framework, that is, of a self-contained derivation of consequences from a highest principle, is precisely the criterion of non-contradiction. If a contradictory moment does arise, then according to the rules of traditional logic the deductive structure appears to have been violated. You can already see from this that Hegelian philosophy, for a quite specific reason, finds itself opposed not only to traditional philosophy and the traditional metaphysics of the permanent and the immutable but also even to traditional logic. This means that Hegelian philosophy does not recognize the principle of contradiction insofar as this philosophy holds that thought itself does not find its truth by proceeding in a wholly non-contradictory manner. Rather, it is driven into repeated contradiction precisely through its own rigor and possesses its logical unity, its non-contradictory character, only as a fully developed totality, not in the single steps which it undertakes. This is a further challenge which dialectical thinking poses for us, a challenge which you can already appreciate right here once you properly understand this claim that a so-called basic principle or proposition of philosophy, if true, is also false, just because it is only a principle or basic proposition. 6. In order to clarify this once again, we could say that, if for idealist philosophy the idea of the absoluteness of thinking stands at the very beginning, the idea that there is therefore nothing which is not thought, and that consequently, as Fichte himself expresses it, the thinking principle, the I, posits itself as something absolute, then we could say, and this step is already accomplished by Fichte, very much in Hegel's sense, that this first principle is necessarily also already false, for the concept of this thinking which is posited here necessarily involves the moment to which such thinking relates. There is no thinking, there is no thought, which does not involve something thought, something to which it refers. There is thus no thought which, insofar as it thinks, is not more than merely a thought. But if we grasp the issue in this way, and Fichte most emphatically took this step which I am outlining to you here, if we ponder its full implications, then we might say that the principle with which philosophy begins, and the principle of Hegel and Fichte in this decisive point is the same, is at once true, insofar as there is indeed nothing whatsoever which is not mediated, insofar as we can know nothing which we do not know through thought. Yet at the same time it is false, for this apparently absolute origin also involves its own opposite, and the thought of an absolute and creative I or pure idea already inevitably involves the thought of the non-I, the object to which thought relates. Hegel continues, it is, therefore, easy to refute it, that is, a first principle. The refutation consists of pointing out its defect. And it is defective because it is only the universal or principle, is only the beginning. If the refutation is thorough, it is derived and developed from the principle itself, not accomplished by counter-assertions and random thoughts from outside. 7. From these remarks alone you can recognize two decisive features of the dialectical method as a whole. Firstly, that refutation in Hegel does not bear the usual meaning, as it does when we say that some claim or proposition is simply false. Rather, refutation here means pointing out the defect of the claim or proposition, as Hegel says. In other words, with every case of finite knowledge it is pointed out that, inasmuch as it is a merely finite knowledge, and we can express anything specific or determinate it all only as something finite, it is precisely and necessarily not yet the whole. Yet, since is the whole alone which is supposed to be the true, every thought is also to that extent false, although not false in the sense of a particular arbitrary or mistaken judgment that demands correction, as a kind of intellectual defect, but rather false on account of its being a finite judgment. For every finite judgment precisely shows itself, as seems evident, not to be that whole from which alone the concept of truth according to Hegel can be derived. But this also implies that this falsehood is not an arbitrary or contingent feature for its own part, not something which is external to philosophy, to the movement of the concept, but something into which we necessarily find ourselves drawn. In reality this thought can already be seen as a Kantian one, although in Kant it is not perhaps presented with the same consistency and clarity that it eventually acquires in Hegel. For it is the thought that there are certain types of proposition, and this is still expressed in Kant in a much more limited manner, which specifically go beyond our positive experience, that is, in which we apply our conceptual capacities beyond what can be furnished or substantiated by the material of experience. Thus we inevitably find ourselves entangled in contradictions, and Kant attempts at the same time in the second main section of the Critique of Pure Reason, in the Transcendental Logic, to show how we may nonetheless resolve and respond to these inevitable contradictions. This is a remarkable idea which stands right there in Kant but is not further pursued by Kant himself. On the one hand, as we are repeatedly told in the Critique of Pure Reason, we are necessarily caught up in these contradictions, and no epistemological reflection is capable of curing us of this predicament. On the other hand, Kant does believe that he is able to offer a solution to the problem, namely by distinguishing between the different ways in which we may apply the concepts of noumena and phenomena, for which, according to him, quite different laws are supposed to hold. 8. You can see therefore that a certain kind of contradiction is also acknowledged in Kant. But we can see that the experience of contradiction which persists in Kant, almost malgré lui-même we might say, is expressly raised to consciousness in Hegel, is almost turned, we might say, into the organon of philosophical thought in general. This means, therefore, on the one hand, that, while reason necessarily becomes involved in contradictions, it also possesses the power to go beyond these contradictions and to correct itself. And according to Hegel, this is the very essence of the movement of the concept, the essence of philosophy itself. You have to keep both aspects in mind if you wish to understand dialectical thought properly: the unavoidability of contradictions, on the one hand, and the driving force of these contradictions, on the other, where this latter leads to the overcoming or sublation of the contradictions in a higher form of truth, and also, in constant correlation with this for Hegel, in a higher form of reality. For, in Hegel, truth and reality are not conceived as entirely separate from each other, but as two interrelated dynamic moments which depend upon one another and are only constituted in relation to one another in the first place. The second thing which I wanted to point out with regard to these few Hegelian remarks has to some extent already been anticipated in our previous reflections, and it is this: the refutation of the truth of some proposition, or the negation of some proposition, or, to introduce at last the watchword you have surely all been waiting for, the antithesis to the initial thesis, is not something brought in from the outside but that which properly arises out of the consistent pursuit of the original thought itself. If you wish to develop a genuinely philosophical concept of dialectic, and to free yourselves from the debased and pre-philosophical conception of dialectic that can be encountered everywhere, for which dialectic just amounts to saying something like, well, whatever one person may claim, one can somehow also say the opposite, you will see, from Hegel's words, that this popular relativistic wisdom is incompatible with the thought which Hegel was actually trying to develop here. For it is the thought that the antithesis is not introduced in opposition to the initial proposition from without, something which he would certainly have repudiated as a purely sophistical dispute about contrary opinions. Rather, the opposing claim or proposition must always be derived immanently from the initial claim or proposition itself, as I had already briefly tried to suggest with regard to the relationship between the I and the non-I, which indeed furnishes the fundamental theme for Hegel's phenomenology of spirit. To think dialectically, therefore, is not to confront one proposition of whatever kind with some other contrary opinion from outside. Rather, it is to drive thought to the point where it comes to recognize its own finitude, its own falsehood, and is thereby also driven on beyond itself. I would now like to read out the rest of the paragraph from the preface, but I should point out beforehand that, when Hegel dismisses the kind of external position which is opposed to a thought from the outside, instead of being drawn from the very thought itself, he speaks expressly of mere assurances or random thoughts. If you consider Hegel's philosophy as a whole, you will be able to learn a lot more from these two words than they express at this point if taken merely in isolation. For while it is true that thought itself receives this tremendous emphasis in Hegel, that it does indeed claim to develop the absolute from out of itself, this must also always be understood to mean that thought specifically constitutes itself and is objectivity. If we can say in an eminent sense that Hegelian dialectic is a subjective dialectic, namely if the absolute, as Hegel puts it once, is actually subject, 9, this means that thought, and emphatically on every individual level, finds its measure in and is objectivity. And the pathos of this dialectical philosophy in its entirety lies invariably in this: the judgment of the subject, insofar as it is a merely reflective or ratiocinatory judgment, insofar as it reaches out solely from itself to the object, without surrendering itself to the discipline, power, or density of the object with which it must engage, and the subject in question always finds itself convicted of its own arbitrary and contingent character, or, as Hegel also often likes to say, of its own vanity, ten, the contradiction or counter-claim which is not drawn from the matter itself, into which the matter itself is not immanently drawn, or which is simply introduced from the outside. All this is merely ascribed to the contingent subject in its finitude, becomes a mere opinion, becomes that doxa which you already find subjected to the severest criticism in Plato. And the path on which you will find that truth now becomes subject, becomes absolute subject, always involves the correction of all merely particular opinion in and is the objectivity which thinking subjectivity encounters at every individual level. 11 The refutation, as Hegel goes on to say, would, therefore, properly consists in the further development of the principle, and in thus remedying the defectiveness, if it did not mistakenly pay attention solely to its negative action, without awareness of its progress and result on their positive side too. 12. This passage takes us into the innermost character of dialectical thought which I am hoping to convey to you. For the thought here involves the remarkable admission that the refutation in question is not what is normally described as a refutation in traditional logic, namely the process in which we take a certain thought and demonstrate that it is false. For refutation in Hegel's sense arises not against the original thought but rather with the thought itself, and out of its own power. Thus Hegelian dialectical thought generally, and Marxian dialectical thought too as long as it is critical thinking, is always a form of immanent critique. When we subject some structure or other to explicit critique, then this critique, and this is a popular way of expressing it, can be a case of transcendent critique, that is, it can measure the structure or reality in question against certain assumptions which seem indeed to be secure and reliable to the one who is passing judgment, but which are not grounded in the matter itself. On the other hand, it may be a case of immanent critique, that is, a process where what is criticized is measured against its own assumptions, its own principles of form. Now the path of dialectic is always that of immanent critique, that is, in the sense I have just been explaining, we cannot simply confront the matter in question with some criterion external to it or introduce any assurances or random thoughts of our own. Rather, the matter in question, if it is to be disclosed as it is, must be measured, in itself, against its own concept. Thus, to offer you an example from the materialist dialectic, when Marx furnishes a critique of capitalist society, he will never do so by contrasting it with a supposedly ideal society, such as a socialist society. That kind of thing is scrupulously avoided by Marx at every turn, just as Hegel never allowed himself at any point to paint utopia or the fully realized idea as such. There is a serious taboo on this in both versions of dialectic. Therefore when Marx submits a form of society to critique he does so by measuring it against what the society in question claims of itself to be. Thus Marx will say, this society claims to be one of free and just exchange, so let us see if it lives up to these its own demands. Or again, this claims to be a society of free subjects engaged in exchange as contracting parties. Let us see how it stands with this demand. All of these moments which actually characterize Marx's method, and which also make it so difficult to grasp Marx's method properly, instead of misinterpreting it precisely as a theory of an ideal society, something which was very far from his mind, all of these moments are already present in the Hegelian passage we have just been discussing. But I should like at this point to go on to discuss something else. For you have already seen that dialectical negation is not a simple correction, or counter-claim, to a false thought but, rather, if you want to put it this way, the further extension, or, as Hegel rightly describes it, the development of the initial thought, and thus the remedying of its defective character. In this sense it is a genuine correction, and not something which simply eliminates the thought itself. If therefore, to take up the Marxian example again, the thought of a free and just society is subjected to critique, the idea of freedom and justice is not thereby eliminated or dissolved in the dialectical method. Rather, we are shown how this idea is not yet realized in the reality which is compared with the idea. And the concepts of freedom and justice which have prevailed hitherto are also themselves modified in the process. That is to say, they cease to be as abstract as they initially present themselves to thought, and thereby become more concrete. Now this all sounds harmless enough, and you may even breathe a sigh of relief and say, well, it seems the dialectic is not so terrible after all, that all this talk of contradiction was not meant so seriously, and the whole thing does not appear to conflict that much with the rules of common sense. We do not have to be so narrow in our approach, we can expand our limited thoughts, can go beyond them and in this way eventually reach the whole. And indeed there is something of this common sense about the dialectic. Yet the matter is not nearly as simple and straightforward as this. And here once again we come to a critical point in the conception of dialectic which I would ask you to bear clearly and constantly in mind. For Hegel says that this would all be fine and good, That thought simply develops and manages to avoid refutation. But Hegel says that the critical thought, that is, the thought which measures the matter against itself, which confronts the matter with itself and drives it onwards, pays attention solely to its negative action, without awareness of its progress and result on their positive side. 13 This means, in the first place, that Hegel is extraordinarily serious about refutation in his sense, that we do not simply have the whole at our disposal, that we cannot simply extend our concepts at will with the sovereign gesture of a God who assigns its proper place to everything, simply transcend the limitations of our thought and finally secure its proper place. What is demanded, rather, is that thought must really surrender itself to the dialectic without fear or favor. This springs directly from what I was trying to get over in our last session, namely that the whole is precisely not something already given, that truth is not something fixed and somehow guaranteed. On the contrary, truth itself is something which arises and emerges, is essentially result. But this also means that we cannot deploy truth by introducing it from without, that we cannot, simply by thinking dialectically, already rise above dialectic by virtue of this abstract truth. Rather, we must immerse ourselves in this dialectical process itself. We could even say that there is no other possible way for us to reach the whole except by exposure to the partial, for we do not possess the whole. Only by entrusting ourselves to this partiality, by persevering through this limitation, by recognizing the critical movement itself as the truth, is it possible for us to reach truth at all. On the other hand, and here you see how serious the concept of dialectic in Hegel really is, this means that the next step must also be taken with full seriousness. This step should not simply be relativized as such, insofar as it sees itself in turn only as a partial moment of the whole. For this implies in turn that the next step, namely that reflective negativity which manifests the defective character of the finite, is not yet itself the truth either. For this step, insofar as it inevitably misunderstands itself, turns into untruth once again and is thus driven on beyond itself. And the inevitable untruth in which it is then caught up is just what prevents it from appearing simply as an extension or correction of the false. It is what necessarily and inescapably lends it the appearance of an absolute contradiction. You can see from all this that the concept of contradiction, despite all the relevant qualifications, is indeed an extraordinarily serious matter here. To take another historical example, if the men who brought about the liberation of bourgeois society during the French Revolution had not seriously regarded this bourgeois society as the realization of a just society as something absolute, if their own limited intellectual perspective in this regard were not effectively at work as an explosive force, then the revolution as a whole would never have come to pass. But, at the same time, this defective understanding involved in turn that particular limitation which made this into a merely relative historical achievement after all. I could perhaps express this thought in another way, which serves to bring out something I attempted to introduce at the beginning, namely the idea of the temporal core of truth itself. 14 For it is here that you probably approach the deepest point in Hegelian thought, and from which you may be able to grasp that idea. It implies that no thought can actually be thought which frees itself from time, from its own temporal core. Thus a thought, or a political thought, and the phenomenology of spirit itself is a politically conceived work in a preeminent sense, which tried to relate immediately to what is absolute, to a justice beyond time, instead of growing from the concrete conditions of its own time and measuring itself against them. Such a thought would not actually be in a superior position to these concrete conditions of the time. It would only be more abstract, and would fall powerless precisely by virtue of this greater abstractness. It would forfeit the very power to become actual which ultimately justifies the truth of a thought from the dialectical perspective. This is, so to speak, the political or practical dimension of the idea of the temporal core of truth. This implies there is no universal truth resting statically within itself, and no such truth about society. For truth itself only ever emerges from the concrete situation, and once it absolves itself from the concrete situation, or believes that it can simply rise above the latter, it thereby finds itself condemned to powerlessness, and can only bring about the very opposite of what it believes it is able to effect. I have introduced these reflections here as a model to show you something else which is also extraordinarily important for the general climate of dialectical thinking. I am talking about the continual interaction between an extremely theoretical thought and an orientation to praxis. Here too we find that dialectical thought is fundamentally different from traditional thought. For dialectical thought does not just present us with an elaborated theoretical system from which practical conclusions are produced only after the entire theory has been duly settled. Rather, all levels of dialectical thought, we might say, effectively yield sparks which leap from the extreme pole of theoretical reflection to the extreme pole of practical intervention. And if I have indicated the logical structure of the thought here, the unavoidable limitation of the contradiction involved, or the central role of concrete political praxis in contrast to an abstract political utopia, for example, this must be recognized as a crucial issue for dialectical thought in general. We must really accustom ourselves to the idea that the unity of theory and praxis, as conceived in all dialectical thought, already in Fichte, and certainly in Hegel and Marx, is already the kind of unity which does not merely spring forth at the end but consists in just such a continual interaction as I have tried to suggest. And this itself is also a consequence of what we have called the temporal core of truth, a consequence which is fully acknowledged by Hegel. For this means that truth itself cannot be set over against time in a purely contemplative sense. Rather, in possessing a temporal configuration of its own, truth always possesses a quite emphatic relationship to possible praxis as well. The paragraph from Hegel which we have been discussing concludes as follows: the genuinely positive exposition of the beginning is thus also, conversely, just as much a negative attitude towards it, viz. Towards its initially one-sided form of being immediate or purpose. It can therefore be taken equally well as a refutation of the principle that constitutes the basis of the system, but it is more correct to regard it as a demonstration that the basis or principle of the system is, in fact, only its beginning. 15. This effectively recapitulates what we already heard in the last session, that the definition of zoology, say, as the theory of animals is not identical to a developed zoology, that this bare principle or proposition doesn't give you the zoology. You can only possess that when you advance concretely from this definition or its concept and explore the development of particular animals and their relationship to one another. But the passage actually says more than this. For when you hear in this way that a first principle or proposition is only a beginning, this again may sound quite harmless. Thus you might understand it in the following sense and say, of course, if you have such a first principle, like Fichte's initial proposition, you have to develop it further in order to acquire richer content gradually as you proceed. But here too I should remind you once again that conceptual expressions such as only a beginning bear much more weight in Hegel, and must be taken much more seriously than you may initially imagine. For it is not just that such a principle or proposition must gradually come to acquire rather more color and more contour, as non-dialectical and traditional modes of thought might typically put it at this point. It is rather that such a principle or proposition, as long as it is merely a beginning, as long as it is merely abstract, as Hegel would say, is also actually false. And the abstract in Hegel does not mean quite the same thing as the concept of abstractness in our ordinary mode of thinking. What is abstract for Hegel is not simply the universal as such but, rather, what is isolated, the particular determination insofar as it has been detached, abstracted in the literal sense of the term, from the whole in which it belongs. And the movement of thought itself, as a movement towards the whole, is in a Hegelian sense a movement towards the concrete, understood in the sense of what has grown together, just as one of the determinations of truth for Hegel is that the truth is indeed essentially concrete. 16. In this connection, therefore, the abstract is the merely particular, that which remains merely isolated, and the beginning is false precisely because it is abstract, because it is isolated, because it has not yet passed over into the whole, or because it has not yet come to itself. Thus the relation between the development or execution of the task and its simple beginning is not like that between the final image and what appeared on the drawing board in the form of a pre-delineated schema. We are talking rather of the very process in which truth emerges for itself. These are the things which I wanted to get over to you today by way of introduction to the question of dialectics. 17. Lecture 5, June 3, 1958. Ladies and gentlemen, in our last session we made an initial attempt to grasp the concept of dialectical negation rather more closely, that is, to explicate the notion of dialectical contradiction. From what we have said, I believe that it is now already possible to dispel one of the most common and vulgar conceptions regarding the dialectic, the idea that dialectic amounts to an egregious intellectualization of experience and thereby also to a dubiously harmonious understanding of the world. The argument goes something like this. If we do undertake, with a dialectic, to grasp everything that is as a movement which arises from its contradictory character, if we submit everything that is to an intellectual schema and proceed as if the world in itself were utterly and entirely rational, then it is only on these assumptions that the world can be utterly and entirely constructed, as they say. But surely, it is claimed, this simply neglects the irrational aspect of things. As it happens, in a recent essay on Eichendorff, I was able to point out a particular passage where Eichendorff, who himself hailed from the broad tradition of German idealism, had already charged the whole of post-Kantian philosophy, albeit in a rather summary way, with neglecting the darker and dissonant side of experience which can never be brought to full rational clarity. One in this kind of thinking, therefore, the dialectic is subjected to the kind of charge which a certain German tradition, and not the most noble one in my opinion, has frequently raised against the French spirit, and specifically the spirit of Cartesian thought. The reflections we have already pursued should enable you to see how inappropriate this approach actually is. For the Hegelian philosophy in particular, by virtue of its dialectical character, that is, through its recognition of the moment of negativity, is opposed to the idea that everything can simply be entirely construed or constructed by ratio in a seamless and unbroken fashion. We could express this in a very pointed way, and say that this philosophy is indeed an attempt to construe or construct reality, but precisely not as a seamless process. It attempts to do so in the breaks and fractures, and by virtue of the breaks and fractures harbored within reality itself. And if I may reveal to you here something of the fascination which the dialectic has always exercised upon me and my own intellectual efforts, and which it may also come to exercise upon some of you, I could almost say that this fascination springs from the way that dialectic somehow promises to square the circle and not just promises to do so. For it does indeed claim to construe or construct precisely what cannot simply be exhausted in rationality, the non-identical, that which cannot itself be immediately construed, and thus to grasp the irrational by appeal to consciousness itself. I might also describe it, thereby turning a Hegelian trope upon a much more modern pair of opposites, as an attempt, through ratio itself, to rise above the opposition of the rational and the irrational. The negative, as I pointed out last time, is not some kind of supplement to the positive claims of thought, something counterposed to thought merely from the outside. Thus the dialectical antithesis, the dialectical counter-thesis, is not something posited externally in opposition to the initial thesis, something which thought must also address. Rather, the essence of the dialectical process lies in the way that the antithesis is derived from the thesis itself, in the way that what is comes to be grasped as both identical and non-identical with itself. It is precisely because this moment of negation is harbored in the specific thesis itself rather than counterposed to it from without, and precisely because in order to grasp these moments properly at all we must not reduce or simplify things in advance, that the dialectic acquires that seriousness which I talked about in the last session. Perhaps we could also capture this seriousness by saying that dialectical thinking is a form of thinking which does not define or determine the particular by reducing it to its class or type, by subsuming the particular beneath ever more inclusive concepts. Dialectical thinking is thus an attempt to grasp the particular not by resorting to classification but rather by disclosing its own specific character, by trying to break it open, as it were, and thus reveal the opposition between particular and universal in the object of thought in each case. But subjective reasoning, and thus the supposedly all-governing rationality, is thereby also simultaneously exposed to its own opposite through the power of what is, of the particular which cannot be exhausted without remainder, of the non-identical, of what is other, of what can properly be brought to consciousness. Not by ratiocinatio, that is, not by mere processes of inference, but only by attending or looking on. In this sense, therefore, dialectical thinking is not actually a rationalistic form of thought, insofar as it is critically directed both against the opaque and unarticulated and against the limitations of every individual rational positing. So that our reflections may not remain too formal, something which could hardly be avoided at the very beginning, this might be a good place to say something about the debate over rationalism. This debate, ever since the controversies which arose in connection with the philosophy of Jacobi II and later in the wake of Hegel's polemic against Schelling III, has continued to play a significant role in philosophical thought, for thus on the one side we have rational thought in the usual sense, which was rather derogatively described by Hegel as the philosophy of reflection, a mode of thought which appeals exclusively to the usual logical forms, definition, classification, inference, specific conceptual articulations and distinctions, and all such features, and accepts nothing as genuine knowledge which is not couched and developed in these forms 5. And on the other side we have all those philosophies which are commonly and rather crudely characterized as irrationalist in character, the last major and significant representative of which was surely the philosophy of Henry Bergson. 6. These philosophies basically defend a standpoint which Schelling was the first to formulate, claiming that the merely finite knowledge produced by the understanding, to express this in the language of German idealism, does indeed remain merely external to its objects and reveals little of the actual life of reality. True knowledge, by contrast, is therefore one which sees the matter in question from within, as it were, instead of merely struggling to grasp and order it from without. But, in return, such knowledge appears to sacrifice those criteria of controllability, necessity, and universality which Western scientific thought had come since its Cartesian origins to regard as its highest criteria. I believe that this Hegelian talk, and this dialectical talk in general, about rising above certain fundamental oppositions, and this is indeed one of the most essential motifs of all dialectical thought itself, can be exemplified particularly well in relation to this so-called controversy over rationalism, a controversy which also finds its own place in Hegel's thought and is seriously addressed there. For on the one hand Hegel furnishes a most emphatic critique of all merely mechanical or classificatory thought, and I believe I have already pointed out how the kind of tabulating mentality which has effectively come to prevail in scientific thinking today was already expressly attacked in a passage from The Phenomenology of Spirit. 7. But on the other hand he also fiercely attacks the kind of thought which is shot from a pistol, 8. Which aspires to grasp the absolute immediately or at a stroke, something which his erstwhile friend and subsequent opponent Schelling appeared above all to embody at the time. And one could specifically interpret the Phenomenology of Spirit, this first outstanding major work of Hegel's, as an elaborate attempt to play each of these mutually contradictory moments off against the other, ultimately allowing them to criticize one another and be reunited on a higher level after all. What are we to say to all this, if we permit ourselves to consider this alternative between very different philosophical approaches from a rather greater distance? On the one hand, we must acknowledge that thought does not actually possess any non-conceptual forms it can appeal to, that since we have acquired the sort of classificatory and definitional techniques that are developed in formal logic we cannot simply leap out of these forms. And the claim of reason itself, and thus the very meaning of reason, in other words, the question regarding a truly rational order for the world, cannot be separated from this conception of reason as a conceptually perspicuous order of knowledge itself. And thus in Hegelian philosophy as well we discover that traditional logic, which Hegel of course criticized at its most central point, namely the principle of contradiction itself, is not simply displaced by dialectical logic. I believe it is extremely important, if you wish to understand the dialectic properly in this regard, for you to be quite clear that to think dialectically is not somehow to think in a non-logical way, or somehow to neglect the laws of logic. Rather, to think dialectically is to allow particular determinations to point beyond themselves whenever they come into contradiction with themselves, is thus to render them fluid through the application of logical categories. From this point of view you can regard Hegel's entire logic as a kind of self-critique on the part of logical reason, the kind of critique which logic applies to itself. All of the traditional logical forms are retained within Hegel's logic. you will find them comprehensively discussed in the third major division of Hegel's so-called greater logic, in the logic of the concept. But at the same time Hegel shows with remarkable perceptiveness that, while these structures of traditional logic, in their usual form, are indeed indispensable, they cannot constitute the whole of knowledge as long as they are taken in isolation or treated simply as so many particular determinations. On the other hand, what is generally described as a rationalism also has a truth moment of its own. For it is a repeated attempt to bring home to thought precisely what has been excised by thought itself, what has been lost to actual experience through a form of reason which dominates nature and itself alike. It is an attempt to do justice within philosophy to all that has been sacrificed to the process of enlightenment. A rationalism as a whole, we might say, shows a tendency to acknowledge precisely what has been obscured in the ongoing process of European enlightenment and effectively vanquished by the dominance of reason, everything that appears weaker or disempowered, everything merely existent that cannot be preserved in essential eternal forms and has therefore been dismissed as simply ephemeral, a constant tendency to vindicate a place for this even in the thought which has abjured it. And it is probably no accident, and not merely a correlation prompted by the sociology of knowledge, but surely something profoundly connected with the essence of these irrationalist philosophies if they have tended to be reactionary or restorationist in character, if for the moment I may use these words in a non-derogatory sense. In the sense, that is, that they somehow wish to lend a voice to all that has been sacrificed to history, though without thereby grasping the necessity of this sacrifice, or this defeat, within themselves. A rationalism thus reminds us 9 that, while human beings have been able to escape the blind compulsion of nature only by means of rationality, by means of the thought which dominates nature, and would sink back into barbarism if they were to renounce this rationality, it is equally true that the process of the progressive rationalization of the world has also represented a process of progressive reification, just as the reification of the world, the petrifaction of the world is an objectivity which is alien to human beings, on the one hand, and the growth of subjectivity, on the other, are not simply opposed to one another, are not simply contradictory, but are mutually correlated so that the more subjectivity there is in the world, the more reification there is as well. And it is precisely to this that a rationalism responds. Once thought has grasped this fatal structure, which is nothing but the dialectic of the process of enlightenment itself, it cannot simply abandon itself to one pole or the other, and it certainly cannot seek the kind of wretched middle way that claims that we must somehow also find a place for the unconscious or the irrational alongside ratio itself. For an irrationality which is circumscribed in this way, merely tolerated by ratio and a kind of protected natural reserve, has indeed thereby already been consigned to destruction, no longer possesses any real power, is indeed impotent. And the desire of dialectic is precisely to refuse such impotence in thought, to insist that thought must also harbor the possibility of its own realization within itself. The conclusion which Hegel draws from the alternative here is not to pit the alleged powers of the irrational against the powers of the rational, as people tend to do today within the dismal administrative intellectual regimes of the present, which strive to bring everything, even the supposedly irrational, under conceptual bureaucratic categories, and thus neatly separate the class of rationality from that of irrationality. This wretched response is precisely what Hegel disdained, and he attempted instead to pursue what strikes me as the only possible path to take, by means of consciousness itself, by means of developed logical insight, or, if you wish, by means of enlightenment, to call enlightenment itself by its proper name, to expose in enlightenment itself those moments of reification, alienation, and objectification by rational means, moments which can otherwise be exposed only in an external and therefore powerless fashion. The task, in other words, is to take up the moment of irrationality into thought or ratio itself, as its own immanently contradictory element, rather than just playing this off against thought in an external way as an alternative worldview. Or you could also put it this way, to comprehend for its own part the irrationality which eludes reason itself, and also, precisely through reason, to extend the critique of reason far beyond that attempted by Kant. To show that reason, insofar as it necessarily entangles itself in contradictions, repeatedly fails to do justice to what is not identical with itself, with what is not itself reason, and thus repeatedly miscarries. This is the very situation in which dialectical thought finds itself in relation to the controversy over rationalism. 10 And it strikes me as symptomatic of the appalling vulgarization of dialectics today that someone like Lukács, 11, who really ought to know better, has written a book entitled The Destruction of Reason, 12, which should never have seen the light of day. Here he simply brands absolutely everything that looks like irrationalist philosophy, including Nietzsche, and also an utterly misunderstood Freud, with a cliched label of fascism, without realizing that a dialectic that does not also effectively incorporate the moment which is opposed to cognitive ratio essentially forfeits its own character and reverts precisely to the kind of mechanistic thought which the great pioneers of dialectical philosophy had so emphatically repudiated in the first place. With reference to one particular passage from Hegel, I would now like to show you how inappropriate the usual charge of intellectualism raised against dialectical thought actually is. But before I do so, I should also warn you once more against one misunderstanding which is so widespread that I cannot avoid drawing your attention to it, in spite of its primitive character. This is the misunderstanding which complains that philosophy intellectualizes the entire world when it employs the means of reason, as if for God's sake it could appeal to any other means. For naturally thought in general, once it begins, must indeed be thought, cannot consist in mere protestations, in mere enthusiastic effusions, about that which is not itself thought. On the other hand, however, thought possesses the remarkable and deeply rooted capacity within itself to call this too by its real name, that is, to articulate that which is not itself thought. And here is the relevant passage, drawn once again from the preface to the Phenomenology of Spirit. Thus the life of God and divine cognition may well be spoken of as a disporting of love with itself, as theologians have indeed done. But this idea sinks into mere edification, and even insipidity, if it lacks the seriousness, the suffering, the patience, and the labor of the negative. 13 Once again, in these remarks you can feel the distinctive atmosphere, the very savor of dialectic, in a very striking way. For in a formulation such as this you see how the standard separation between the sphere of logic, which is marked by the concept of negation or negativity, and the sphere of real human experience, which is expressed by words such as seriousness, suffering, patience, labor, has been revoked. These categories are not strictly held apart from one another in Hegel, as they are in classificatory thought, and, whenever Hegel comes to speak of contradiction, there too we encounter that human moment of experience, of suffering, of negativity, in the sense in which we can suffer from a negative condition or situation. This is because, in Hegel, that labor of the concept in which we are said to suffer is also always a labor of the subject, in other words, is an activity and achievement of human beings engaged in knowing. And this human activity and achievement involves not only the intellectual sphere which has been divorced from the concrete content, but also the whole of experience, one could almost say, the whole history of humanity. So that every process of thought is also always a question of suffering or of happiness, and this whole separation of thought from happiness, or of thought from suffering, for the dimension of happiness and of suffering is indeed a single dimension, must be revoked by a thinking which is fully aware of its own historical conditions, conditions which are comprised in the totality. In my little book on Hegel I once declared that Hegelian philosophy is indeed life repeated, as it were, that in this philosophy we actually do have our life again in the many-colored show of things. 14 What I wanted to say was that the thought process presented in Hegel's philosophy as a whole is indeed an entirely logical process, but at the same time a process which, by virtue of its own logical character, also points beyond abstract thought and is nourished on forms of experience with which we are all familiar. And thus, if one could say that Kant's philosophy represents an impressive attempt to salvage ontology precisely on the basis of nominalism, we should have to recognize that all of the distress and dissatisfaction occasioned by the loss of metaphysical meaning also found its way into the logical exertions which Kant was obliged to undertake, that this distress and dissatisfaction would indeed be a condition of those logical exertions. And perhaps I can clarify my own attempts at dialectical thinking in the following way. For the essential task here, as I see it, is not to logicize language, as the positivists want to do, but rather to bring logic to speak, and this precisely captures Hegel's intention, namely that happiness and suffering may be revealed as an immanent condition, as an immanent content of thought itself, that thought and life alike may be redefined and reinterpreted, that this task be undertaken with all possible rigor and seriousness. And it is of course precisely this aspect which is completely misunderstood as mere intellectualism in the standard hostility to dialectical thought. But, in terms of traditional, and now exhausted, thought, the dialectic naturally finds itself caught between Scylla and Charybdis. Thus, on the one hand, it is reproached for being unduly intellectualist, for logicizing the supposedly irrational aspects of experience. On the other hand, every common or garden logician will naturally respond to remarks like Hegel's by saying, well, this is just emotional talk. What has thought got to do with all this seriousness, pain, labor, or suffering in general? These are completely different categories. But the essence of dialectic lies precisely in this, that it tries by means of thought itself to undo that separation of spheres which is preeminently reflected in the common or garden cliché of the three faculties of thinking, feeling and willing. And the celebrated notion of the unity of theory and praxis itself is only the highest expression of this attempted revocation, if you like, which cannot of course imply a mere restitution or restoration of what was once single and undivided. It points, rather, to an imminent process of reunification, in and through separation, of what has been divided. But I shall continue with the rest of the passage we have been discussing, in itself, that life, the life of God is indeed one of untroubled equality and unity with itself, for which otherness and alienation, and the overcoming of alienation, are not serious matters. But this in itself is abstract universality, in which the nature of the divine life to be for itself, and so too the self-movement of the form, are altogether left out of account. 15. I should like to take this opportunity to clarify one or two particular expressions which are indispensable to an understanding of Hegel, and I cannot avoid pointing out here that these concepts, which are by no means easy to grasp in their precise logical meaning in Hegel, have nonetheless found their way into everyday language, although the actual influence or authority exerted by a philosophy and the general intelligibility or accessibility of that philosophy obviously have no direct relationship with one another. I am talking about the concepts of being in itself, being for itself, and being in and for itself. Even if we have never heard of Hegel or the dialectic, we often say things like, in itself that's true, or that's true in and for itself, without expressly reflecting that in using such an expression we are already involved in a process. And while we may know how this process begins, it is hard to see exactly where it will take us. To talk about something in itself is to talk about something insofar as it is such and such, is not yet reflected within itself. The concept of being for itself is also relatively easy to understand if you take it quite literally, thus something for itself here not only means something separated or split off from the whole, although this aspect of separation plays a very important part here, but also suggests what it does when we say, for example, that in himself this person is a scoundrel, but for himself, in his own eyes, is a decent and upstanding human being. That is, he doesn't reflect on what he is, he may not even realize his own untrustworthiness, but regards himself, through narcissism as the psychologists would say 16, as a wonderful human being. Thus, for himself, he is a wonderful person, but in himself he is still a scoundrel, that is, in terms of his objective behavior, as this is actually revealed in his social role or conduct. The Hegelian philosophy which indeed essentially addresses, like all dialectic, the way in which subject and object, the subjective and the objective, are also separated from one another, undertakes specifically to expose and explore this difference between being in itself and being for itself, although there are two paths it can take in this regard. Thus in the logic the path leads from being in itself through being for itself and ultimately to being in and for itself, whereas in the phenomenology one might say that the opposite path is pursued, as we begin from subjectivity, which then arrives at consciousness of itself, or being for itself, and solely through this consciousness and all of the reflection involved in it finally arrives at being in itself and being in and for itself. This contrast between being in itself and being for itself is intended with such seriousness that we can already recognize the really decisive objective motif, the objective dimension, at work here, the thought that human beings, and Hegelian philosophy is in its origins a humanistic philosophy, are not identical with themselves in the function which they objectively fulfill in society, and that their social role, to use a modern expression, or their being in itself diverges from the consciousness which they have of themselves, or their being for itself, and this disparity, this non-identity between human beings and their own world, which is indeed by no means yet their own, is itself the ground of that diremption, that suffering, that negativity which, as I have already suggested to you, can only be overcome through the labor, the patience, the seriousness, the exertion of the concept. Thus you can see how the logical metaphysical conception of Hegel is indeed directly associated with such emotionally charged expressions as seriousness, and so on, expressions which at least are saturated in actual human experience. Thus I doubt if you will now be that surprised if I challenge so much of your preconceived image of Hegel, and perhaps even shock some of you, when I say that the celebrated triadic schema of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis actually plays nothing like the role in Hegel's philosophy, which it is commonly believed to do. And I would be more than happy if I could succeed here, from a whole variety of angles, in awakening a concept of dialectic which is liberated from the automatic responses typically encouraged in the context of examination questions. Of course, there is also something in all that, but as long as you imagine that we must have a thesis, a claim, a proposition, which we then externally confront with the opposite, before finally combining them both in a similar more or less external fashion, as long as you think in this way, then you will actually entertain nothing but the most external conception of dialectic. The seriousness of the dialectic springs precisely from the fact that it is not some such external intellectual game of juggling contradictions. For the contradiction itself springs from the thesis itself, and shows itself as such only because the speculative proposition itself is always at once true and false. And indeed Hegel himself mounted the most vigorous criticism of this standard manipulation of the concept of dialectic in terms of this triadic schema. The most important thing for you here is to learn what it really means to confront reality in a dialectical spirit, rather than in asking mechanically after the relevant thesis, antithesis, and synthesis in every possible context. And I should also confess right now that I always find the word synthesis profoundly suspect, and, if I understand you rightly, I feel that most of you will also experience a certain sense of horror at the concept of synthesis. The passage in Hegel which relates specifically to this issue, and which I would like to read to you now, runs as follows: of course, the triadic form must not be regarded as scientific when it is reduced to a lifeless schema, a mere shadow, and when scientific organization is degraded into a table of terms. Kant rediscovered this triadic form by instinct, but in his work it was still lifeless and uncomprehended. Since then it has, however, been raised to its absolute significance, and with it the true form in its true content has been presented, so that the concept of science has emerged. 17 You can see how this already suggests a critique of the kind of tabulating thought which in the era of the administered world today has indeed almost become the universal form of science in general, a form of thought against which language itself now obviously occupies a hopelessly defensive position. Under no circumstances, therefore, must dialectical thought even tempt us into forcing the objects of experience into such a schema. For to think dialectically is precisely to take individual objects as they are, to do so genuinely rather than in some limiting way. Not to limit them or subsume them under their next highest concept, but to try and do justice to the life that prevails in the individual thing itself, that prevails in the individual concept itself, the life that was indeed regarded by Hegel as something contradictory, as something antagonistic in character. Hegel had already clearly recognized the danger that dialectic can degenerate into a mechanical device, although this is often what he has himself been accused of encouraging, and anyone who takes the actual trouble to study Hegel's major works, and especially the Phenomenology of Spirit, will find how little of this mechanical aspect is to be found there. I should like to conclude for today with the following excellent formulation from Hegel: The knack of this kind of wisdom, the dialectic as an external method, is as quickly learned as it is easy to practice. Once familiar, the repetition of it becomes as insufferable as the repletion of a conjuring trick already seen through. 18. If I may give this thought a somewhat broader twist, it is this: where philosophy itself is concerned, all those claims to knowledge which can be foreseen from the moment that thought begins and thus inspire the reaction we know that already, which are fundamentally contained in advance within the generic concept that lies above them, are essentially worthless. And it may be regarded as an index of the truth, or an index variat falsi, whether thought is capable of encountering something which is not self-evidently contained in the thought at the moment when it arises, which does not simply emerge from it all at once. There is no truth, one might almost say, which in this sense could be foreseen on the basis of the formulated thought, and it is probably the surest symptom of the appalling degeneration to which dialectic is exposed today, under the name of diamat, of the way it has now reverted to pure untruth, that ready-made phrases and slogans do spring forth as if in a conjuring trick and enable us to judge and subsume everything without undertaking the labor and exertion of the concept which is demanded by the dialectic. We could also express this by saying that dialectic has here forgotten what it intrinsically and essentially is. In other words, it has ceased here to be a critical theory and has turned into a merely mechanical process of subsumption. No form of thinking is immune to this. Even the principle of dialectic, opposed as it is to mechanical thinking, can revert to a conceptual mechanism once it is no longer genuinely dialectical, that is, once it forfeits intimate contact with its object and ceases to respond carefully and closely to that object. In short, nothing guarantees that dialectic itself cannot in turn become ideology. Lecture 6, June 10, 1958. Ladies and gentlemen, in our last session we discussed the problem of the supposed intellectualism of the dialectic, or what was once described as panlogism. Point 1. And today I think I can draw out some further implications of that discussion which may help you to form a more definite conception of dialectic, and indeed to correct the idea of dialectic with which most of you will probably approach dialectical philosophy from the start. I would not wish to seem presumptuous here, but I imagine that most of you, insofar as you are not already professional philosophers, as people love to put it, will have this initial rather automatic reaction to the dialectic: well, dialectic is surely a matter of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. Now I will not say that these concepts are completely irrelevant here, or that they have absolutely nothing to do with the dialectic. But, as far as these concepts are concerned, we must remember what dialectical theory itself has already insisted upon, namely that all propositions in abstracto, such as the truth consists in thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, possess no truth unless and until they are unfolded and developed. I would go further and claim we commit no great sin against the spirit of dialectic if we say that, as soon as such concepts are rigidly fixed, as soon as they are turned into a sort of manual for thinking dialectically, they become the opposite of what Hegel intended them to be. And indeed I can appeal directly to Hegel himself here for this qualification regarding the significance of what is often called the triadic schema, namely the three-step movement of thesis, antithesis and synthesis, is already expressed in the phenomenology of spirit itself, and indeed in words which will be able to take us much further. Hegel writes, of course, the triadic form must not be regarded as scientific when it is reduced to a lifeless schema, a mere shadow, and when scientific organization is degraded into a table of terms. Kant rediscovered this triadic form by instinct, but in his work it was still lifeless and uncomprehended. Since then it has, however, been raised to its absolute significance, and with it the true form in its true content has been presented, so that the concept of science has emerged too. I had already drawn your attention to this passage last time, and I would like to add a second formulation which may serve as a warning light against a particularly dubious use of dialectic, when this triadic schema is manipulated to produce the opposite of truth. Thus Hegel continues, the knack of this kind of wisdom is as quickly learned as it is easy to practice. Once familiar, the repetition of it becomes as insufferable as the repletion of a conjuring trick already seen through. 3. The thought here, therefore, is that even a method which is recognized in abstracto as the most advanced method of thought only produces falsehood when it is mechanically applied, that is, if the facts are simply subsumed under the method, if our experience or insight into the facts themselves fails to interrupt this subsumptive procedure. Paradoxically, we could say that the moment that dialectic becomes a kind of device, or a recipe, when it is manipulated as a method, then it is inevitably converted into untruth, and indeed in the strictly dialectical sense that it thereby comes into contradiction with its own concept. For to think dialectically is precisely to think through rupture, to think in such a way that the concept is emphatically brought to criticize itself in terms of what it attempts to cover, while the merely factical is measured in turn against its own concept. And the moment we retreat from this approach, when we no longer undertake what is described in another passage as the labor and the exertion of the concept, for the moment we believe we have the method securely at our disposal, then the method has already been falsified and distorted. And actually this is also a much more general experience, as we can discover again and again in the context of art. Kandinsky once formulated the same insight beautifully in his book on the spiritual in art, when he said that the moment an artist believes he has found himself, has finally discovered his style, then he has generally already lost it. 5 Here again you have a sense of the atmosphere of dialectical thought, something which is very important, for it involves a concrete sense of its opposition to the need for security about which I have already spoken to you. 6 It is one of the challenges of dialectical thought, and not perhaps the least, that in thinking dialectically we must avoid thinking like a certain kind of Kantian schoolmaster. Now I have the method, and once I have this, then nothing can surprise me anymore. Hegel vigorously rejected precisely this idea of method, where we can just carry on blindly and automatically, as it were, instead of undertaking the labor of thought itself at each and every moment. But these are actually relatively modest and straightforward insights, although it is really far more difficult to observe these insights in one's actual concrete thought than it is to entertain them in general terms. There is no guarantee, even when we try and think dialectically, that dialectical thought cannot fall into the embarrassing repetition of the conjuring trick which Hegel so vividly warns us against. And it is certainly most important, as a thinking individual, resolutely to resist any mechanical application of one's own categories, in other words, to reflect constantly upon these categories, to examine whether they are still indeed appropriate to the things which are being thought under them. What is so impressive about Hegel in this connection, and what I particularly wish to bring home to you here, is that he does not merely content himself with identifying and polemically repudiating this mechanical application and ossification of dialectical thought. But, rather, as he invariably does with all other negative elements, Hegel also strives to grasp this specific phenomenon itself, attempts to derive even this aberration of thought, this reification and rigidification of thought, from out of the living process of thought itself. And this is entirely characteristic of dialectical thought generally, for the vital nerve of the dialectic is precisely to resolve all that is rigid, reified, ossified. But it does so not by simply confronting all that with what is allegedly vital and immediate, but, rather, by making use of what has become hardened, recognizing what is sedimented here, the congealed life and labor as it were. Thus it only overcomes what has become rigid and ossified by allowing it to move by virtue of its own power, of the life that has been precipitated in the things and concepts which confront us in an alienated form. What is excellent, however, not only cannot escape the fate of being deprived of life and spirit in this way, of being flayed and then seeing its skin wrapped around a lifeless knowledge and its conceit. 7 Here you can also feel something of the power of Hegel's language, although he has generally been deemed a poor stylist, as they say, in comparison with the allegedly excellent stylist Schopenhauer. And this is obviously because those who have more or less unjustly assumed the role of judges where linguistic ability is concerned imagine they can assess the language of philosophers by how far it directly accords with healthy common sense and ordinary spoken language, which is certainly not the case. In Hegel, the power of his language lies rather in a remarkable kind of second immediacy or sensuous vividness, for in the impressive conceptual architecture of Hegel's thought the concepts themselves are filled with such inner life, unfold so intensively and dynamically, that although they seem entirely abstract they nonetheless reassume all the color and fullness of life within themselves and thus in this remarkable way also begin in sparkle. I do not think a genuine analysis of Hegel's language has ever really been undertaken. Such an examination of his philosophical language would not only be welcome in itself but could also illuminate the very deepest recesses of the philosophical content in Hegel. In a sentence like the one just quoted you actually find the essence of Hegel, where the idea of the bare skin from which the life has fled is directly applied to something as seemingly abstract as knowledge and consciousness. I have already spoken in our last session about Hegel's philosophy as a rather remarkable field of tensions, where the movement lies not in continuous transitions but in a tremendous exchange of energy, where thought leaps over from the pole of concretion to the pole of abstraction. In this way we pass from what is closest to us, what is most sensuous, to precisely what is most remote. Instead of producing some middle term or connection between both, we see how the universal and the particular, the two extremes, touch. And again this is profoundly bound up with the very content of Hegel's philosophy, for it is indeed the essence of dialectical teaching that the universal is also always the particular and the particular the universal. Thus you can see how much the content of this philosophy has entered here into the boldness of such language. And in this context I might point out, for those of you who have studied German poetry in particular, that this approach to language may also help to shed entirely new light on the poetry of Hölderlin, in a way that has perhaps never seriously been considered before. Hegel continues, rather we recognize even in this fate, that people believe they already possess the matter itself in the dead skin, the power that the excellent exercises over the hearts, if not over the minds, of individuals, as well as the constructive unfolding into universality and determinateness of form, in which its perfection consists, and which alone makes it possible for this universality to be used in a superficial way. 8. Hegel is saying something extremely profound here, namely that thought itself must assume such a specific objective form of presentation if it is to relinquish all merely arbitrary claims and contingent expressions of subjectivity, but precisely in assuming this kind of universality, this determinate conceptual form, it also inevitably courts the danger of becoming a recipe, of being reified and misused. In other words, the misuse which Hegel warns us about, the superficial application of the triadic schema, is by no means external to thought, for it is produced precisely when thought itself does what it must if it is to rise above the merely arbitrary hic et nunc, if it is to become an objective truth. In other words, the untruth that arises from such rigidification is inseparable from the objectivation which belongs to truth itself. We cannot have one without having the other. This is one of the most important dialectical principles there is. Thus one cannot acknowledge the power, the objectivity, the binding character of truth, without thereby constantly exposing thought to the danger of simply becoming independent as such, of forcing itself externally upon the matter itself, of being utilized in a blunt and mechanical fashion. In this warning against the mechanical use of dialectic you have an exemplary case of dialectical thinking itself. For the vital nerve of dialectic can be recognized right here. Truth and untruth are not external to one another, are not simply opposed to one another as an abstract antithesis. Rather, the passage into untruth inhabits truth itself, as its fate, as its curse, as the mark of the context of guilt in which it stands. And likewise the path which truth itself traverses, and truth is indeed a process, is solely a path through untruth. You can see, therefore, how dialectical thought responds even to such a warning against its own misuse. This warning against the misuse of the triadic schema involves an insight which perhaps should not be forgotten as another fundamental insight of dialectical thought. This is the idea, which just gives a slightly different twist to what we have been saying, that there is no thought which cannot also become false as soon as we isolate it, and abstractness for Hegel is always a matter of isolating something and detaching it from the context of the whole. Hegel showed as much in the passage which I have tried to interpret for you, where he alludes to the idea of the world process as a kind of divine play. He says that, while this may be true in itself, it sinks into untruth, that is, into insipidity and indifference, if we fail to pursue this process itself in detail. 9. I think we can go much further here and say there is no truth whatsoever, not even the truest theory or even the theory of dialectic itself, which cannot also immediately become untrue if it is torn from its context, and especially if it is made to serve particular interests. There is nothing in the world, not the highest creations of philosophy or even the highest creations of art, which cannot be misused by clinging to them in isolation, and thereby holding people back from other things, deceiving people about other possibilities, generating false and untrue satisfactions, or creating spurious satisfactions. And if you expect me to suggest a practical application of dialectic here, it would be precisely this: dialectical thought is extraordinarily mistrustful of any attempt to isolate and thus misuse thought. If any particular aspect of knowledge, any finite instance of knowledge, and any specific knowledge regarding the whole is always a particular instance of knowledge, acts as if it were the whole, is posited as absolute, it can readily enter the service of untruth and become an ideology. You can observe this most strikingly, of course, throughout the Eastern Bloc, where the dialectic has been elevated to a kind of state religion. Although an honest and genuine attempt has perhaps occasionally been made there to render certain aspects of dialectical theory intelligible to people, the dialectic has long since functioned, as a religion of the state, to justify a praxis which only perpetuates the repression which the impulse of dialectic inspires us to challenge. But I would merely say that we should not draw the opposite conclusion, that dialectic is untrue simply because such nonsense has been produced in the name of dialectic. For the dialectic shares with everything which has appeared as truth in history, and certainly with the truth which is embodied in Christianity, that it has been misused for every violent or shameful deed and for every kind of torture. I think it is a dangerous delusion to imagine that the Gallimaeus commonly known as Diomed could actually tell us anything valuable about dialectical theory itself. But here I should like to return to the question of the relative irrelevance of the triadic schema. You will easily be able to grasp this relative irrelevance after what I have said so far if you remember that the dialectic is not actually method in the traditional sense. Although I realize that this is not what Hegel himself literally says at this point, I believe this claim can indeed be defended in the spirit of Hegelian philosophy. What I mean is that the dialectic is not a mere procedure through which mind firmly secures its objective character. For the movement of dialectic is always also supposed to be at once a movement of the matter itself and a movement of thought. But if that is so, if the dialectical movement is a movement of the matter itself and can be accomplished by reference to the matter itself, then it springs from this that any form of dialectical reflection which is purely methodological, that is externally foisted upon things, already violates the character of dialectic. This will perhaps become clearer to you if you grasp precisely why the usual conception of the dialectic as a game of thesis, antithesis and synthesis is so absurd and superficial. When the pre-philosophical consciousness hears of dialectic and of thesis, antithesis and synthesis, it thinks something like this: well, you start by setting up some proposition or other, then you introduce another proposition which is the opposite of the first, but there is some truth to both of them. So then you have the synthesis. The so-called synthesis emerges once you have exhausted the framework of the two mutually opposed propositions with which you began. I will not simply assume that you feel quite the same aversion towards the concept of synthesis that I have strongly experienced since my early youth. But the way all this is presented here is certainly entirely misleading. For the dialectical movement does not arise by taking an initial proposition and externally supplementing it with the opposed proposition. It arises when the contradictory moment is discovered in the proposition originally expressed, when it is shown that the proposition which initially presents itself to you in a fixed and congealed form is a field of internal tension, exhibits a particular kind of life within itself, so that the task of philosophy is in a sense to reconstruct this life within the original proposition. The synthesis cannot therefore be understood as the extraction of the common element in the two earlier propositions. Indeed, Hegel specifically describes the synthesis as the opposite of this, namely as a further negation, as the negation of the negation. Thus the antithesis, the opposite of the original proposition, which is spun from this latter, is qualified in itself, as a finite proposition, as untrue in turn. And, insofar as its untruth is further determined, the truth moment in the proposition which was originally negated thus reasserts itself. And the very essence of dialectical thought lies in the contrast between this kind of thinking, as I have here been describing it to you, and the purely abstractive kind of thinking preoccupied with logical extension of its concepts, which posits oppositions externally and then regards the common feature abstracted from both terms of the opposition as the result. That the triadic schema is not terribly important after all springs precisely from the fact that this schema is merely the subjectively abstracted process, a description of the subjective comportment with which we approach the matter itself, while this subjective comportment for its part is only one moment which Hegel then corrects through another which is described as a process of simply looking on point 10, and this is the process of abandoning oneself entirely and unreservedly to the matter itself. I am well aware that these rather formal considerations which we have just been talking about will hardly be able to satisfy you in this form, and I expect that you will naturally raise an objection which, as I can vividly recall, occurred to me too on my first encounter with dialectical philosophy. Why must everything really be a matter of contradictions? Are there really only contradictions everywhere? Aren't there also just simple differences? Is it not simply an arbitrary decision, and here we face the serious suspicion that concepts can easily become a straitjacket? Is it not simply a violent attempt to contain or restrict reality by means of method, if we try and interpret everything that exists in terms of contradiction? In terms of internal contradiction, admittedly, but still a form of contradiction, whereas there is just an abundance of disparate qualities, as different from another as green and red and blue. And if we consider the beauty of the full range of colors, for example, would the attempt to read everything part out as a form of contradiction not basically involve a process of leveling, specifically of abstraction and homogenization? 11. This objection has often been raised in the history of philosophy, of course, and I think it would be a very bad idea if we simply try to settle it with an elegant gesture rather than confronting it. The objection was first specifically formulated, and in a very acute manner, from the perspective of traditional Aristotelian logic, namely by the Aristotelian philosopher Trendelenburg, 12, who made this the basis of his general critique of Hegel in the first half of the 19th century. 13. And the objection was taken up again, in a quite different form, at the beginning of the so-called Hegel Renaissance in Benedetto Croce's book on Hegel. 14. This book can be said to have initiated the said Renaissance, although in fact Croce approached Hegel with a slightly bad conscience, for rather like Trendelenburg he actually wanted to bring Hegel closer in a certain way to positivistic strands of thought, to what had formerly been described as the philosophy of reflection. Thus the rebirth of interest in Hegelian philosophy which was begun by Croce remained somewhat problematic from the start. Now, in order to put all of this into its proper context and perspective, I should probably also say something about what seems to me the most appropriate way for thought to proceed in general. For I would argue that it is certainly not the task of thought to try and bring everything that exists under one common denominator. Indeed, the need to do so has itself been challenged by the dialectic, and since in this regard, we might almost say, the dialectic has recognized the naivety of a philosophy which imagines it could possibly capture the full riches of experience in some sort of butterfly net, it might be said that dialectic has in a sense already reached the point where we can also raise very significant objections to dialectic itself. If the dialectic were in fact merely the kind of reductive thinking which tried to bring all actual differences under the formula of contradiction, then it would actually be equivalent to the attempt to explain everything by appeal to a single fundamental principle, the very thing which the dialectic repudiated. In the first place, I believe that the role which dialectical thinking has to play, the significance which attaches to dialectical thought or philosophical thought in general, is to act as a kind of discipline or counterforce in relation to living experience. In a sense, therefore, we really think dialectically when we also specifically limit ourselves, for, if we perceive only differences, if we are aware only of variety, without discovering any unity in this difference and variety, we cannot perceive the contradictory character which is concealed in all this variety. For then thinking threatens in a sense to dissolve, to forfeit its own theoretical form, and, while we cannot turn theory itself into an absolute, we cannot have anything resembling knowledge without theory either. There is a paradoxical relationship there. If theory imagines that it has the whole within its grasp, that it is itself the key by which to explain everything, it has already fallen victim to the worst kind of hubris. Yet if thought entirely lacks this theoretical moment, this aspect of unification and objectivation, then we are basically no longer talking about knowledge at all, and we have effectively resigned ourselves simply to registering a more or less external, disparate and disorganized multiplicity of data. And it is precisely the need to work against this, without doing too much violence to the things themselves, which underlies the specifically dialectical approach. But this way of putting it is still rather unsatisfactory, for now you may say, well, you are introducing the dialectics simply as a sort of cure for the soul, or for the concept, because it is healthy and advantageous for thought to have a method like this, something reliable to hold on to, although you do not really believe in it yourself and actually maintain there is no such thing as the absolute. And in fact I feel at this point that I am obliged to say something decisive about dialectical method and the concept of contradiction. The concept of contradiction is no more to be hypostasized than any other concept, that is to say, it is no more the key to the dialectic than any other particular concept, and that is because the dialectic actually consists solely in the relation of concepts to one another rather than in some absolute dignity bestowed upon any single concept. But you still have a right to know why the concept of contradiction does indeed play a central role in the dialectic, and for what substantive rather than merely ancillary reasons this is the case. Thus I would begin by pointing out that, insofar as every finite judgment, by virtue of its form as a judgment, by virtue of affirming A is B, already claims to be an absolute truth, to be the truth itself, it comes into conflict with its own finite character, with the fact that no finite judgment, precisely as finite, can be the whole truth as such. 15 And if the concept of contradiction plays such a conspicuous role in the dialectic, if it is the concept which expects so much from the process of simply looking on, of giving ourselves over to the things themselves, if it is specifically described in the context of dialectic as the moving principle, then the reasons for this are to be found precisely here. The category of contradiction, or the origin of the modern doctrine of dialectic, derives in fact from the critique of pure reason, and, if you wish to understand more fully the theme of these lectures which we have broached but not completely developed today, you would do well to take a closer look at what Kant calls the transcendental dialectic either in the original itself or by means of one of the reliable secondary discussions of this text. The basic thought here is that, as soon as we try and extend the fundamental concepts of our reason, what are called our categories, beyond the possibilities of our experience, beyond the possibilities of sensible intuition, or in other words when we try and formulate infinite judgments, then we inevitably run the danger of positing mutually contradictory judgments, each of which seems to be equally convincing. Such as the claim everything that happens has a first beginning in time, or the claim everything that happens in time involves an infinite series. 16 And we can make analogous claims with regard to space. Or again, everything that exists is subject to the law of causality, or again, there is also a causality of freedom, that is, there is a point where the causal series is suspended. 17 All of these mutually contradictory propositions arise when our categories, which in Kant's view function solely to organize our experience, begin to run riot as it were, to operate simply in a void, thereby claiming to possess an absolute truth through their own resources while they are actually valid only in relation to the phenomena with which they are confronted. Kant thus introduced the idea of contradictoriness into the context of knowledge in a new and indeed particularly emphatic way, for he argued that human reason inevitably becomes entangled in such contradictions. Since we cannot help but pursue our thought to the utmost, since the tendency to transcend the limits of finitude is also inscribed in the structure of our thought, we are constantly tempted to formulate such problematic propositions. And the fact that we can come to understand why these contradictions arise, and thus in a sense resolve them, does not really help us that much, as Kant himself points out in the Critique of Pure Reason. 18 And then, with Hegel, you may introduce a simple operation and argue as follows: if you tell us these contradictions are necessary contradictions which our faculty of knowledge is quite unable to avoid, contradictions therefore in which we constantly find ourselves entangled, and if your own supposed resolution of these contradictions does not ultimately help us, why not actually follow this path to the end? Why not explore these unavoidable contradictions more closely? Why not expose yourself to these contradictions which you claim are unavoidable? In short, why not try and reach the truth precisely through the movement of these contradictions? And this challenge which Hegel raises is indeed based upon an essential epistemological modification of Kant's philosophical position, namely upon the fact that Hegel no longer accepts the tried-Kantian opposition between sensibility and the understanding, between thought and experience, in the way this is somewhat naively and drastically insisted upon by Kant. For Hegel says that I basically cannot know how I can then arrive at something like sensibility at all, that there is nothing sensuous which is not itself mediated by the understanding, and vice versa, and therefore that this whole rigid separation between sensibility and the understanding, upon which the Kantian doctrine of the antinomies is based and which can in a sense protect me from becoming entangled in contradictions, cannot ultimately be sustained at all. And that is precisely because there simply is no sensibility without the understanding and no understanding without sensibility, and thus this movement of contradiction which Kant regards merely as a malfunctioning on the part of consciousness is actually one of the accomplishments necessarily prompted by the essence of spirit, and that is precisely why thought essentially moves and develops in and through contradictions. Lecture 7, June 12, 1958. Ladies and gentlemen, in the last